The original Pokémon games are still the highest selling mainline titles in the entire franchise, with over 31 million copies sold. So when Pokémon FireRed and LeafGreen released, remakes of the most successful Pokémon games, they should have been unstoppable.
Instead, they became the worst-selling remakes in the history of Pokémon. They sold less than Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, less than Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, and less than Heart Gold and Soul Silver.
So how does a remake of the best-selling mainline Pokémon games ever become the weakest-selling remakes in the entire franchise? The answer has nothing to do with quality and everything to do with timing. In the late 90s, Pokémon wasn't just popular, it was a cultural takeover. Pokémon was everywhere. Kids watched the anime before and after school, they traded cards on the playground, and battled their friends and siblings late into the evening. The original games didn't just sell because they were good, they sold because they were riding the single biggest gaming fad of the decade, Pokemania. But by the early 2000s, something was quietly changing. The children who grew up with the series were getting older, and somewhere along the way, Pokémon stopped being seen as cool. Many even felt the pressure to leave this kids' game behind.
Not only that, a new wave of franchises were rushing to fill the vacuum, all fighting to become the obsession of a brand new generation. Don't get it wrong, Pokémon wasn't dead by any means, but it was no longer dominant. And that shift matters, because when FireRed and LeafGreen released, they weren't launching into the peak of Pokémania. They were launching into the aftermath. The original audience was moving on. The next generation of players had more options. And nostalgia wasn't exactly a selling point yet. But generational change alone doesn't explain everything.
There was another problem. Yes, they added a free wireless adapter for trading and battling on the Game Boy Advance. Yes, you could finally play as a female character. Yes, the graphics were updated, but at their core, they were still Kanto. The same gyms, the same story, and the same Pokémon. And in 2004, that mattered. Today when a remake is announced, it feels like a massive event. But back then, players didn't really know what a remake meant. Would it expand the world? Would it add new content? Or is it just the same game again? For many players, the reaction was simple. Didn't I just play this? We had already been sold an updated version of the original games once with Pokémon Yellow. And when Gen 2 gave us Pokémon Gold and Silver, it didn't just introduce a new region, it also saw us traveling back to Kanto once again.
And then came Pokémon Crystal, another lead version of the same games with a few upgrades, like animated sprites and minor additions. But that wasn't enough to stop Crystal from being the lowest selling mainline Pokémon title ever. Which tells us something important. Players get excited by exploring new regions, a brand new cast of Pokémon, and the thrill of the unknown. But selling the same game for a 5th or 6th time, that's a much tougher sell. And yet, FireRed and LeafGreen did add new content. The Savvy Islands, post-game Johto Pokémon, and brand new mystery gift events. However, the marketing didn't really focus on that. It leaned on nostalgia, improved visuals, and wireless connectivity. And in 2004, Pokémon nostalgia wasn't the powerful weapon that it is today. It had only been 4 years since the final Western release of a Gen 1 Pokémon game. That's not nostalgia, that's just a recent memory. Research shows that nostalgia only starts to peak around 20 to 30 years after childhood, not 4. We all remembered the first generation, but we weren't missing it. And that's a huge difference.
Plus, there was one even bigger hurdle fans were asked to jump. For the first time in the series' history, a Pokémon game was forcing you to start over completely from scratch. When Pokémon Ruby and Sapphire released, players were shocked to find out there would be no backwards compatibility. Your Generation 1 and 2 Pokémon could not be transferred over. And for the first time ever, you were gonna have to catch them all over again, while leaving your entire collection of Pokémon trapped in the past. And it's important to understand this. Pokémon wasn't just about finishing a game, it was about building something permanent. Since 1996, the Pokémon games were set in an expectation. Your journey continues, your team carries forward, and your collection grows forever. A new generation wasn't a replacement, It was the next step. But now, all of a sudden, your childhood team, gone. Your level 100 starter, toast. And your hard-earned legendaries, old news.
Years of progress was locked away on old cartridges. For longtime players, Generation 3 had lost one of its strongest selling points. So when FireRed and LeafGreen arrived, they didn't just look like a nice trip down memory lane. They looked like an attempt to rebuild a bridge that had just been burned. FireRed and LeafGreen became necessary pieces of a complicated puzzle that eventually opened the door to completing your national Pokédex within Generation 3. And for some, the idea of taking on this challenge all over again didn't feel exciting. It felt exhausting. Especially when you consider the time it was being released. Pokémon FireRed and LeafGreen launched in 2004, but in January of that same year, Nintendo had already announced the Nintendo DS. By then, if you were thinking about a new Pokémon game, you were dreaming about the next entry in the series.
Even though the DS could still play Game Boy Advance cartridges, the psychological shift had already happened. The Game Boy Advance suddenly felt like yesterday's system, while FireRed and LeafGreen were releasing right into that awkward window right at the end of an era. So instead of jumping back into Kanto, many fans decided to hold on to their money. Not because they didn't care, but because they were anticipating something bigger. Now to be fair, 12 million copies sold is anything but a flop. FireRed and LeafGreen are still the second best-selling titles on the Game Boy Advance, just behind Ruby and Sapphire. By any normal standard, they were massive hits. It's only when you compare them to what they were remaking do they begin to feel small. And here's the craziest part. While Pokémon FireRed and LeafGreen may be the worst-selling Pokémon remakes, they're also some of the most well-known and most played Pokémon games ever. Not through official means, but through emulation, ROM hacks, and fan-made projects.
The third generation of Pokémon is the backbone of an entire Pokémon modding scene. Games like Pokémon Radical Red and Pokémon Rocket Edition wouldn't exist without FireRed and LeafGreen's framework. For a whole new generation of players, Kanto wasn't even experienced on an original system, but instead through a Nuzlocke, a randomizer, or a complete game overhaul. So while sales numbers tell one story, their popularity today tells another. FireRed and LeafGreen may have underperformed in 2004, but over time, they've become part of the foundation of modern Pokémon creativity. And with their re-release on the Nintendo Switch over 20 years later, already hitting the top of Nintendo's eShop charts, it's clear to see that what was once their biggest weakness has now become their biggest strength.
If you enjoyed this video, leave a like. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe for more. And make sure to let us know in the comments which remake you think is greatest.